Well, hey there, it's Liz Rohr from Real World NP, and you're watching NP Practice Made Simple, the weekly videos to help save you time, frustration, and help you learn faster so you can take the best care of your patients. So in this week's video, it is an interview with my personal lawyer, Irnise Williams, and we had such an amazing conversation. So we gathered the questions from the Real World NP community of questions that you'd like to ask a lawyer, and really kind of went through piece by piece, and we got to a lot of things. But a lot of big questions that people have. Should I have my own malpractice insurance? What are the most common reasons to be sued? How to document things appropriately? And like a whole bunch of other like big questions that people really worry about as nurse practitioners, newer and experienced. So I really hope you enjoyed this episode of NP Practice Made Simple. And you can find Your Nurse Lawyer on Instagram at Your Nurse Lawyer. And if you haven't signed up for the Ultimate Resource Guide for the new NP, be sure to do so at realworldnp.com/guide. You'll get these videos sent straight to your inbox every week with notes from me, patient stories, and bonus content that I really just don't share anywhere else, including the opportunity to submit your questions for future upcoming interviews. Without further ado, though, I'm going to share my interview with Irnise. Thank you so much for being here. I'm so excited. I'm so excited. So,
I'm
do you want to
excited.
introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Irnise. I am a nurse and a lawyer. I've been a nurse for 12 years and an attorney for 6 years. And I work with healthcare providers and healthcare entrepreneurs who have their own practices or their own businesses to ensure that they understand their risk and liabilities. I do some community education as well. I'm a mom, I'm a wife, and I'm a current New Yorker and travel nurse currently during the COVID crisis.
That's so cool. That is so cool. Thank you so much for being here. I cannot wait to answer all of these questions. I asked the real world NP community what their legal questions were, and we broke it down into the categories of the kind of general most common things. And do you have any disclaimers you wanna add?
Yes, I will add that none of the advice that I give here, medical or legal, qualifies as attorney-client privilege or establishes any relationship of attorney-client. It is general advice that I would give in any type of public setting. And if there are any specific questions or scenarios, I would definitely tell you to consult with an attorney in your area.
Totally. And you have such great resources to direct people to. So,
Yeah.
absolutely. So, I think we broke down kind of like the major questions that people had. So, the first one is about kind of like the general topic of documentation. Like, I think that people are so worried about what to chart, what not to chart. Like, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, documentation is a conversation, I think, for all nurses, nurse practitioners, even some providers who are just unsure about what is enough and what is acceptable. I always lead with if you had to take this into court, you want to be able to back yourself up. Because when someone sues a provider or an organization, the only thing you have is your chart. I think sometimes people think they will have their memory, but it could be years, it could be 5 years, it could be 10 years, depending on what the situation is. And so the only thing that you will have is what's in that chart. And you want to be able to cover yourself with the information that's in the chart because that's all you're going to be able to bring into court. There
Mm,
are some instances where there will be some external information that could potentially be provided, but in healthcare cases, all we have is the documentation of the conversations that we have with our patients, the treatments that we provided, their refusals or if they agreed to go forward with that. All of those decisions need to be in the chart. I know as new providers, they struggle with time management because you're trying to see a lot of patients. The expectations on you are extremely high. Even if you have 3, 6 months, 9 months worth of training, the expectations are high and the pressure is there. And so you may not have all of the time to document right there on the spot. But I think there are some tools and resources that are out there depending on what EMR system you use to kind of pre-chart some items, to do some shortcuts, to do some short notes, and to figure out ways to help you centralize some of the very important and critical information, and then maybe kind of go back and review and edit later. I think that's the key thing. I think when there are situations where you are asking or advising your patient to do something that they're not agreeing to, those are the things you want to put in the chart as well. So if you're telling the patient they need to see a specialist and they're saying, I'm not going to see a specialist, I don't think that is important, those exact words should probably go in the chart.
That happens all the time.
And then we'll be like, okay, fine, whatever, we'll talk about it later. And adding that as well, saying, patient said, quote, I'm not going to see a specialist. And then I understood what they said. I validated that that was an okay option for now and that we would follow back up on it later, right? So not that you're even allowing that to pass and just say like, fine, we'll just leave it at that. That you're saying, okay, I want to give the patient autonomy, but I also want to reiterate to them the importance of going to do whatever I'm advising them to do. So that is a type of documentation I think that becomes critical when patients say, oh, there's a delayed diagnosis. Or, I didn't know that I had this disease. No one ever told me that. And that comes up. Like someone will say they don't know they have diabetes, but they're taking medication for their diabetes. And I'm like, you picked up the medication. Someone had to have told you along the way.
Yes.
But if there's no information in the chart that said, I educated the patient or I referred the patient to speak with the diabetes specialist or with someone on the team to have a specific conversation about this, then that's where providers get caught up. Basically, there's no actual documentation on what steps they took to ensure that the patient knew, understood, verbalized understanding, and then they were in a position to take the next steps. So I think sometimes where providers struggle as well is you will advise a patient to do something and not ensure that they're able to do it, right? So if you tell someone, I need you to go see the specialist, and they say, okay, they take the referral, but they never go. And then they come back and you say, hey, you didn't go to the specialist, here's another referral. No one ever asked them why they didn't go. It could be because the copay is $50. It could be because it's outside of where an area that they can get to easily. It could be that the hours are limited or that they couldn't get an appointment. Those conversations have to be documented and those questions need to be asked. There are a lot of assumptions that go into having these conversations with patients where, oh, patient is just non-compliant. Never say a patient's non-compliant in the chart. Right?
Yeah.
Like you do want to speak to the reasons. Like a patient is undomiciled, so picking up medication may not be something that is that they can do at the time. Like sending medication to a specific pharmacy may be difficult for them because if they're moving from shelter to shelter, they may not have access to that pharmacy like in another month or in another few weeks. Or they may not have access to money in another few months or another few weeks, even if you give them a 60 or a 90-day supply, right? And
so providers are liable in those situations?
Not necessarily liable or not, but if it's not documented and something happens to that patient, you could be brought to court in a case where a family member may say, well, they didn't take care of my family member because they were homeless, or they didn't take care of my family member because of X, Y, and Z. You want to be able to say, I offered the patient a 90-day supply, let them know that if they ran out and weren't able to go to the pharmacy to come back and we would give them another 90 days. Right? So you want to have those very specific conversations documented. I think when I read a lot of charts, there's a lot of general information. Yes, putting in the H&P is important, but the H&P is in a whole bunch of other places. So yes, that is of course an easy information that you can add to the chart, but some of the specifics of the conversations that you're having with the patient have to be there to show that there is a progression in the care that you're providing. You don't want a patient to continue to come to see you week after week, month after month, and nothing is getting better, and there's no information in the chart as to why, right? So, in a job that I worked before, we had a patient who was a diabetic. Everything was under control. She switched insurances, and they began to deny the medication she needed. The provider began to document every single time the patient came how much work was put into trying to get that patient help. The patient ended up dying because the insurance denied their medications. And if the provider and the diabetes coordinator and all these people didn't document the reason why this patient no longer had access to the medications that they needed, it could have looked like we were neglectful in that situation. But they went above and beyond and ensured that they documented every phone call to the insurance company, every letter, every outreach to an organization to attempt to help this patient to get access to that, to try to change her insurance. All of those specifics were put in the chart. So when she was literally on her deathbed and the family told the provider, you know, we knew exactly why this happened. And it was not the provider's fault. It was not the organization's fault. It really spoke to the struggles and the failures of the insurance company. But if you work in a federally qualified healthcare center, there are times when you get audited by the federal government. And when they see those types of things, they're going to dig deep. They're going to want to know why this happened, especially if they're getting a bill for you know, weeks and weeks of care in an intensive care unit for someone who you're managing and who you're caring for. They want to know, how did this patient go from being well managed, never being hospitalized for 5 years, and then all of a sudden being in an ICU for 6 months, right? So
that's horrifying. That is so enraging and horrifying.
It was one of the hardest situations. I think the provider was so heartbroken. The family was heartbroken. I mean, every person involved, because they really had worked so hard to get this person to that point of being well controlled. And that little simple decision to change her insurance because she thought it would be a better option literally led to her death, right? And so it's tragic. There's so many tragedies that happen. And I think as providers, we make assumptions that everyone knows why. We make assumptions that, you know, even during COVID, if you're sending someone a referral, for the longest, radiology centers had closed and they weren't seeing anyone. They didn't care COVID negative, how severe, like those, that needed to be documented, right? So there have been so many delays in care this year. And if your patient had a disease process that needed to see a specialist or see a radiologist or get an MRI or something that could not be done, you need to speak to that, because 10 years from now, COVID's going to seem like it never really happened. Like as much as
so
it is, you know, like it is a very intense situation now, and it is all our life revolves around.
Yeah.
In 10 years, it's going to be a figment of our imagination. We're going to forget how hard we labored through that. It's just like having a baby. Like, you know, like, oh my God, that was so terrible. And then 2 years from now, you're like, oh my goodness, I think I can have another baby, after you complained, you know, about how hard it was. So
it's so true. And I think about that when I'm doing my documentation now, and the like boundaries where I feel like we're pushing because people don't want to be seen in person. We're trying to keep them on a telemedicine visit because they don't want to expose themselves. And I'm just documenting like, this is in the COVID pandemic, patient declines, you know, but it makes me nervous thinking about that future thing, you know, that future backdating. I think what would be really helpful, if we can kind of like keep with the documentation, but kind of like incorporate what like the most, I think, because I think that if I'm obsessed with the lived experience of the new nurse practitioner, and I can already hear the panic. I'm getting a little bit of panic too. But in terms of like, so like the documentation thing, the time management thing is so hard, right? But like, I think if we work backwards, like what are the most common things that people get sued for? And I think that because obviously we want to give that maximal optimal care at all times. But if we're talking about like the frame of documentation, what do you feel like in your perception, in your experience, like the most common things are? It sounds like delay in care is one, neglect is another. Like if you can kind of like lay that out, like the most common reasons that people get sued and like how to avoid them, I think that would be super helpful to tie into that documentation conversation.
So yeah, most family practitioners, providers get sued in federally qualified healthcare centers, like those, you know, groups of people who treat patients on a daily basis, mostly get sued for delay in diagnosis.
Most get what?
Get sued for delay in diagnosis.
Oh.
That is the biggest one. That one costs the most and goes to court. So if someone is diagnosed with breast cancer, you feel a lump, they go to, you know, radiology or, you know, whatever you guys call them, you know, to go get further care.
Yeah.
And you don't follow up to make sure that they follow through with the entire process. And then 6 months later, they went from stage 1 to stage 3, and now they're having a mastectomy, and now they're like all these other things that are happening. That is a lot of what usually happens. And it's usually cancer. Cancer is usually the one that causes people to sue the most. I feel like there have been very few lawsuits about like the chronic illnesses, right? So I think some people assume that those people who have chronic illnesses may come back and sue. But I think chronic illnesses, it looks so different in every single person, and it's just a long process that it's very rare that someone has a chronic illness necessarily and they come back and sue because they had a chronic illness that eventually led to either an amputation or someone's death. That's really rare because we know that it's so much that goes into a chronic illness and managing a chronic illness, that it's usually not the provider's fault. And it's something that's very hard to prove.
Yeah.
The other, I think, big one that I think people sue about is treatment, like how they're treated, right? So like discrimination. So they discriminated against me because I was homeless or because I was Black, Hispanic, transgender. Like those are big because people feel like they're not being treated appropriately or given the appropriate care. And because of that, it led to whatever outcome has happened. So that's the other big one. And like family practitioner, for any nurse practitioners that work in the hospital, a lot has to do with prescriptions and things. I mean, I guess providers, family nurse practitioners write prescriptions as well. Appropriate prescription. So not necessarily for the patient, but the federal government will come after people who aren't writing appropriate prescriptions. So your DEA license, you do want to protect it, of course, and you want to make sure that there aren't pads laying around, that it's not easy access to print prescriptions illegally, like someone may have access to the office or to the documents, things like that. And not necessarily people being held. I think people assume that if you get sued that people automatically are guilty. That's not true. It's a process, and it's a very long process. So in an instance where someone brings a case against a provider because of something they did or didn't do, there's an initial investigation that goes into that. And then if there's some substantial evidence that really can be decided by a judge, basically, then that's when it goes to court. But people can call, and make a claim and, call the board on you and do all those different things, but that doesn't mean it always goes somewhere. And I think the anxiety that people have is understandable because it's your life, your livelihood, your license, and you want to do everything to protect it. But in that, they practice defensive documentation. So defensive documentation is where you are basically saying the patient didn't do this, the patient didn't do it. Like, it's very spastic, and it's not showing what it is that you're doing as a provider. It's putting all the onus on the patient, right? So you're saying, I told the patient to do these things, and the patient didn't do any of these things. You're not really talking about the relationship and like the education, the support, the resources. You're focused more on the outcome, right? And so it's like, I told the patient to do this, the patient didn't do this, and now this is what's happening. But in reality, healthcare is a continuous conversation. So if you're educating the patient today, you still may need to re-educate next month, and then month after that. It's like a continual process. I think we can't just assume or count people out just because they're not agreeable to something, because I am a very difficult patient.
I think all nurses are.
And it may take me 2 or 3 visits to really accept what it is that you're saying. I talked about this when I was talking a little bit about diabetes, and I had gestational diabetes, and I was like, I am not checking my blood sugar. And she was like, no, you have to. I was like, I'm not doing that. I work, I'm busy. She was just like, okay. So the next time I came back, she was like, have you been checking your blood sugar? I was like, girl, I told you I was not doing that. And, and so it's like, you have to not just say, patient said no, we left it at that. Just say, I re-educated the patient. I made them understand how important it was. And then I followed back up on the next visit. Like, that's how you document. You don't document all of the negative things that are happening in the conversation, the negative relationship that the patient may have with their disease process or with you or with healthcare. But you have to document what you're doing to get them on the right track, even if they never get there.
Totally.
I
guess one of the things that I was thinking is that, because I've struggled with this, especially with patients, like if they don't want to do things, they have their full right to, right? I guess I'm finding myself a little bit surprised by the, like if you're telling somebody to go get imaging or advising them to get imaging, they agree to it, but then they don't go. I guess in my mind, I've always thought that if they're an adult, if they're like a consenting adult, like they had their cognition intact, that is enough, but it sounds like it's not. It sounds like you kind of, I'm curious about that because I think that well, this could open up a can of worms, but I feel like there's a lot of conversations that I have about empowering patients, having conversations with them and encouraging their own responsibility versus that like kind of like what is that word? I don't know, patriarchal, patronizing. I don't know, whatever that term is of like you telling them what to do. So that's interesting. That's interesting that it's like a lot more.
Yeah, and I think that's what saves people. And so that's why, when I ask people, like, do you know how to have difficult conversations with people? Is because sometimes you think you're saying something and you're relaying some concept to a patient and they understand. And they may just be like, okay, I hear you. And they don't really understand.
Yeah.
I give you an example of like recently where a patient was dying. Like we knew the patient was dying and we're doing just ridiculous things. And that everyone was afraid to tell the family that the patient was dying. And so we're on a phone call with the family, the doctor, the attending, the PA, other nurses. And I finally was like, ma'am, I don't know you and I don't know this patient, but I'm telling you what the outcome is going to be if we don't stop what we're doing and take care of where she is right now. And then the daughter finally sat back and was like, okay, I hear what you're saying. Because everyone was just skirting around the issue and assuming that she knew that her mother was going to die. And I'm like, did you tell her that her mother is going to die and that her mother is dying and that the state that her mother in means that this can be a very quick death that leaves no closure, right? And so I think there is this assumption that we're saying things clearly, and sometimes you have to say things just different ways, or someone has to hear someone else's voice. You want, the nurse to come back and follow up, or you want, sometimes it's the medical office assistant who has a great relationship with the patient who can go in and say, you really need to listen to what the doctor is telling you. I think it's really serious, right? I think we can never discredit anyone's value in educating the patient. It starts from the minute they walk into the building to the minute that they leave. And empowering everyone to be able to build that relationship with the patients allows the provider more room to be the provider and not to have all of these extra things, right? Because the more time you spend trying to convince someone to do something, the less you're really able to actually do the work that you're there to do.
Yeah, totally. And I wonder, and speaking of difficult conversations, we can go in any direction you want, but I think it just kind of ties really nicely into how to tell a patient when you've made a mistake. That's like a general question. We don't have to go into that if you don't want to, and we can.
Oh, I mean, I think that's real. I've been there when gave the wrong vaccine to someone's child and they're like, oh, you wanted this vaccine and not that one.
Yeah.
It happens. So
I told the community about a mistake I made recently about I guess I can say it here too. I had a woman who was pregnant who had a UTI, and I just didn't order the repeat repeat culture a week later because I was moving fast and I wasn't thinking. It was the end of the day. It was a really long day, and she really wanted to get out, and then it's like having that conversation of like, luckily it was nothing bad happened, but like that was uncomfortable. I was like, ooh, that does not feel good, But any thoughts you have about?
Yeah, so the last job, we made a lot of mistakes. So we had a lot of these conversations. And I think the first thing is to be gentle with yourself, right? Like I think we put so much pressure on ourselves as if we have to be perfect, as if the patient expects us to be perfect, as if we're not human. And the anxiety that you feel when you make a mistake is not necessarily that the mistake was made or what the outcome may be for the patient. It's how they're going to make you feel and how you feel about yourself. And so all that energy that is like the hotness, the sweats, the like anxiety that you feel is more about like what are they going to say or how they're going to respond. And so I think if you go in and take a deep breath and really relax and say, okay, to yourself, I made a mistake, and really assess like how this happened, because it's never usually intentional. It's usually because we're busy, we're fat, when we're moving too fast, we have too many patients. Someone called your name in the middle of you doing something that you meant to do, and then you just went to the left instead of the right. Like it happens. And to explain to people, like, to be honest, I think for me, when I've made a mistake or in a situation where someone else has made a mistake and I had to call the patient myself, I always start with saying who I am and, that how long I've been working in healthcare, why I work in healthcare, why it's important to me to take care of you appropriately. And then to admit the mistake I made and say, I'm so sincerely apologize for that. And this is how we're working to make sure that never happens to any other patient.
I feel like if you told me you made a mistake, I like want to cry right now because of like, yeah, it's just so beautiful to say it that way because it's like clearly like you are a very caring person, right?
Yeah.
And so like you would never want to intentionally hurt somebody. So
Yeah.
like I feel like as a patient receiving that, I'd be like, oh yeah.
And so I always was the one who was put on the spot, like, can you call this patient and tell them we took the wrong blood? And I was just like, hey, we've been working to improve the clinic for the last 2 years, and we have made a lot of strides in doing so. But yesterday, we drew your blood with a tube that was expired. Yeah, yeah, it has happened. The only time that I think I exploded was we drew like the wrong labs on someone like 3 times. It was absolutely insane. And I literally had just had the conversation. And so then I just started screaming. I was a manager, but I was like, why would you do that? Patient's gonna hate me. That doctor's gonna kill me. Like, I was acting so crazy. Like the staff were just looking at me, and then like I called my boss, and I was just crying. Like, I can't believe they keep doing this to me. Like, those instances where you keep making the same mistake over and over, it's just no excuse for it.
That's
it's just like you got to figure out a better way. And then that's where like the risk management and compliance team comes in, because it's like if 3 or 4 people are making the same mistake over and over, something is missed, something is happening. Let's figure out why. So I think it's easy sometimes to say people are making this mistake, and there's something wrong with them. But sometimes you have to look at it from a systemic level and say, okay,
totally.
this mistake is happening continuously. What can we do to either fix it or put in a red flag in place that makes people double check, or figure out why this is happening over and over. And then you fix the system, and then hopefully people don't make the same mistake.
Yeah, totally. I guess a question I have about that is like, do you have any like thoughts about like the documentation around it? It doesn't sound like that's a huge malpractice risk of like you making a mistake in terms of like the volume of lawsuits, but do you have any thoughts about documentation of mistakes?
Yeah, so never go back and delete what you originally did.
Totally.
Go in and of course write an addendum to what it is that you're making. And I would never say, like, when you document, you don't have to say, I made a mistake. Like, I would document, order was not placed.
Yeah.
Followed up with the patient, and then say, patient came in, did the order, period. Like, no one can tie that was a mistake. Like if I'm, and I always try to tell people when I look at charts as an attorney or consulting with other attorneys, I look for wording that's like, yes, I'm going to read through 500 pages of documents, but I'm really looking for like things that stick out to me. So if you wrote order was not placed, followed up with the patient, informed them that the order should have been placed. It's 2 days delayed, patient came back, returned, this happened, whatever happened and the outcome, what am I going to say to that, right? Like that healthcare, that is what, and I think we assume that healthcare is a perfect situation. Healthcare is extremely imperfect because it's run by people, right? It's not run by a machine. And so there are going to be outcomes where it's not perfect, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get sued.
Yeah.
And I also try to explain that the most time when people usually sue, it's not normally just because they had a bad outcome, it's because of how they were treated. So if I had a delayed diagnosis, but you treated me so well, when we finally got to the point of getting care and treatment, you made sure that everything was expedited, that I got all of the best care and got the best surgeons and the best. Like, who am I going to come back and sue? Like, it happens. Life happens. People are understanding of that. It's when people are dismissive, disrespectful, and demeaning to patients. And they come back, or they're completely silent about the mistake or the issue. They don't say anything. And it's like, no one expects you to go say, I'm sorry, and to grovel and to ask for forgiveness. Like, we're not asking, patients don't ask for that. Patients usually just ask for some type of transparency. They want to know that someone knew that it was a mistake, realized it was a mistake, and self-corrected, that they weren't telling you as a patient how to take care of them.
Totally.
Right. And so I think that's really the disconnect. And so healthcare providers feel like people sue too much, but healthcare care providers forget that people sue because you disrespected them and made them feel less of a person, right? And so like I've been in situations where people have made mistakes and I've been like, it ain't a big deal. Like it happens.
Yeah.
And then I've been in situations where people have done things where I'm like, I am going to drag you, you know, like, and you have just angered me,
Yeah.
right? And so that's when people sue, is when you take them to that point where you're not giving them the level of respect that they deserve. And so that's the disconnect. So I think a lot of good providers who have all of this anxiety aren't usually the people who get sued. It's the arrogant, the cocky, the I'm better than you, the I make no mistakes, right? So surgeons get sued a lot because they have this air of, I don't make mistakes. There is no way that I did this wrong. If this was done wrong, it was because, you know, and that's why the operating room is a very dangerous place, you know, for egos, emotions, and outcomes because of those types of attitudes. And so I think a lot of family providers feel like I'm like, it's not a lot of lawsuits that can go on in family health because there's just only but so much you can do, and there are so many players involved. It's never just the provider, it's so many other things, so many other layers, insurance, red tape, you know, social workers trying to get, it's a lot. It's never just usually one person. But in healthcare settings where it's usually the mistake of one person, those are very rare. And people will come to the hospital and say, I just want to know what happened to my family member. And the hospital will be like, we can't give you any information. And now you have to sue, because that's the only way you're going to be able to get the chart, the only way you'll be able to figure out what happens, the only way that you'll get some type of closure for someone who either, you know, had some type of long life-changing damage done or who passed away.
Yeah. And it's like, I just keep coming back to like, and this comes up a lot, I think, with new nurse practitioners, is that, and I had this myself when I was new, it was like, I was so focused on like the medical and the doing. And I was still, of course, thinking about the emotional aspects, but I remember as a new grad being like, I don't want to hear about the fluffy stuff. I just want to be able to learn and how to do my job. But it's like, this is so inherent. Like, it's just wild that like emotional connection, closure, validation, all of that stuff, like that is like integral, you know. It's like the outcomes are important too, but like those are the foundations, you know. In the as of this recording, the last week's video, I talked about trauma-informed care, where it's basically like, I don't know, some people I feel like could write it off as this touchy-feely thing, but it's like, honestly, this is the foundations. Like if you're sensitive to people's like needs and rapport and relationship, like, yeah.
That is it. And I think, you know, we would put a lot of lawyers out of business if we tapped into that more. I think there is this conversation that's happening now in birth, you know, in like the birth world, where they're starting to understand trauma-informed care because they have the hardest outcomes. Like you do have to have a happy ending for people to feel good about it. But there's so much trauma that goes on in the care from, you know, conception all the way to birth that people bring to the table, that then if the outcome isn't perfect, that becomes someone's fault, right? And if that isn't treated in the beginning or dealt with in the beginning, that negative outcome is then related to all of the trauma that has happened to that patient.
Totally.
I think if healthcare providers can understand that people bring to you whatever experiences that they have had with providers. When I go to the dentist, I'm always like, I have had terrible experiences with the dentist. And they're just like, but not with us. And I'm like, it doesn't matter, right?
Doesn't matter.
Like, take good care of me, be gentle, right? And the dentist has to take that into consideration and be gentle with me.
Right.
And so it's like, if we put that into like a healthcare setting and say, people who come to see you could have experienced so many different types of trauma, whether it be healthcare related or personal, we have to take that into consideration. We do have to take a second and step back and say, how are you? You know, and yes, sometimes people will go on and on, but you have to be, you know, bold enough to say, you know what? I'm so glad to hear that you're doing well, but let's get to your visit and why you're here. I don't want to waste your time. I know you're busy. Right. So like being able to, you know, give that relationship building aspect of your care definitely leads to people feeling like, oh, I love my provider. They're the best in the world. And when you make a mistake, they're like, oh, don't worry about it. I know you didn't mean to. Like, and that happens where you make the mistake and people are just like, oh, it wasn't intentional. I knew you were busy. Because you took that second to really see who they are as a person and not just who they are as a patient.
Yeah. And I think that like so many new grads, and I work with some mentees one-on-one, and like they all have that experience of like their patients love them because they give them the time, they give them their heart, like all that stuff. So yeah, because I think so many other new NPs in this context specifically beat themselves up about not knowing all the things, and they worry about all the missing things and documenting things wrong. And, there's always things to worry about, right? But if we have the foundations of relationship, then we definitely like have a strong hold to put on. We have so many questions. We don't have to address all of them, but I want to address some of the other ones. So, what about, so I'm going to pause here and we can edit this out. What do you want to, how are we doing with time for you? And, where do you think you want to?
I'm over with time. I think we can go into like the medical malpractice insurance and personal legal representation.
Cool.
I think those two, because we kind of touched on a couple of other things.
Yeah, I think we did. Okay. Okay. So back to recording. So with medical malpractice insurance, this question comes up like all the time. And I'm sure you get this question a million times a day too, of like malpractice insurance. When do you need it? Like, do I need it because of my employer? Like, what are the flavors of that kind of conversation of separate medical malpractice insurance or medical malpractice insurance in general?
So this is such a common topic that I don't understand how nurse practitioner, schools and programs and nursing programs aren't having this conversation at the week before graduation or the month before graduation, right? Like it's a huge issue and the deal. And if you don't know anything about it, you would just like, oh, I'm just going to get it just in case. So if you work for a healthcare organization that provides medical malpractice insurance, and that's all you do, your full-time job is with this organization that is insured and covered, then you're fine. You don't need anything extra or different. And the reason is that if you have it and someone sues either your organization or decides to try to sue you and they find out, you have to disclose it, that you have it. They're going to keep you in the case instead of kicking you out because that's more money to them, right? So your healthcare organization has whatever millions of dollar policy. And if you have a $1 million policy, that's one more million that client could potentially get.
Oh my God, this is blowing my mind.
So you don't, and the way that hospitals negotiate to get people's names off of cases is by saying they don't have anything to lose, like they don't have anything to offer. If you take this from them, they don't have any insurance. We're going to pay you whatever it is that you want to get. But if you take our providers off, if you take our nurses off, if you take our radiologists off, then we can get to the conversation, which is basically the money.
Like settling with
exactly, either settling or even if they go to court, the negotiation they don't go anywhere unless they say like, take these people's names off, right? And so nurses in the hospital who document defensively, and I have this conversations with a couple of different nursing groups, sometimes it's like, you don't have a reason to. The legal team is going to get you out. One, they don't want you on in a seat answering questions because they know how bad it is, right? So they don't want a nurse involved at all because your interest is self and is not protecting the organization. The doctor, if they have to keep the doctor is going to defend themselves, and they're also going to defend the hospital because that's who pays them. So that's who protects them. And it's a lot harder to get a job as a doctor than it is as a nurse. Whereas a nurse will be like, oh, I'm about to throw everybody under the bus and I'll just go get another job, right? And so they do not want nurses on these cases at all. They don't want them deposed. They don't want them testifying. They don't want them near an attorney because so much more could happen. Whereas the patient or the client can be coming for one issue and the nurse is like, and then they forgot to draw labs. And that's just how nurses are. Nurses are, I don't understand why nurses are like this. Like, I don't know. They're so intense when it comes to like documentation and like protecting themselves. And I'm like, trust me, honey, the attorney at the hospital does not want you on their team. Like, they don't see you as an ally. at all, right? So
Oh God.
don't, if you're a nurse practitioner, you don't want to have that extra coverage. If you're doing something outside of that, if you're doing per diem work for a company, if you have your own business, if you're doing like Suboxone treatments in a separate clinic or flu clinics, things like that that may not be fully insured, yes, you should have some type of coverage. I wouldn't go have $1 million coverage. I would maybe have like $100,000 or maybe $500,000 if you're doing some very intensive work. But if you're doing like a flu clinic, you don't need $1 million coverage, right? You
That's
just need
nice to know.
something
Cool.
small, just in case, something happens, someone has a negative outcome and they just may, bring something to the table, because malpractice insurance just isn't about the money. They also provide other resources to you under your coverage. So it's just like home insurance. So home insurance isn't just about like covering just the outside of the house. They may cover different aspects of your home, or if you have a fire, they may put you up in a hotel, like those different tenants of it. Is so in medical malpractice insurance, they provide other things coverage as well. So like if they provide malpractice insurance, sometimes like if you work in a Suboxone clinic, if there's a flood and everything is damaged and you can't work, they may give you money to help cover that or repair the cost of those things. So there are little things that they cover outside of just someone coming to sue you or try to bring a litigation against you. They do provide resources to risk managers. So like if you are working with a medical malpractice insurance, they'll give you a number to call if you're running into an issue to be able to ask questions, because you don't have a risk manager that works for you. So they'll give you resources and access to those people so that you can ask those questions as you may be having an issue when you're out in the field, if that makes sense.
I understand. I understand.
Yeah, so that's really the only time you need it. And then when you talk about having an attorney at your side, as a new nurse practitioner, I think a lot of people, see a contract. Hopefully you read every word of the contract.
Some people don't have contracts actually. Yeah, this is like I have little Wild West. Like I feel like I learned about contracts. Like I was interviewed for a job and they gave me a contract and I was like, oh, okay. I didn't know there was a contract to sign. I read through it. It seems fine, but some people don't even have contracts. So any thought, welcome all of the thoughts.
Yeah. So I think if you're in a situation where you are going to be held responsible for a certain amount of patients, for a certain like outcomes, for either income, like some providers have to bring in see a certain amount of patients and reach a certain amount of like money. Like you have to see this amount of patients and then bring in this amount of money by doing X, Y, and Z. If you have those type of responsibilities, you need to have a contract. Because you want someone to say like, what happens if that doesn't happen, right? Like there are no protections for you. There's no if, ands, or buts. There's no really detailed explanation. And I think that's what happens with a lot of providers. They'll go into a situation and be like, oh, I didn't know that I had to see that many patients, or I didn't know that I had to commit to that many hours of following up on my referrals, or like other aspects of the job that isn't just seeing patient care. There may be other responsibilities that you have, if it's teaching, if it's, precepting, whatever the case may be. You would like those things to be detailed out. You also would like to know when you're going to get a raise. How is it structured? Because if you don't have a contract, they don't have to give you a raise.
Yeah.
Right. So like if you work for me and I say you come in making $150,000, when do you get a raise? When do you get a performance evaluation? When do we look at, your load and see if we need to provide more office hours for you to be able to do different types of work, or to split your time between telemedicine and in person? Like, when do we discuss that?
Yeah.
You as a new practitioner are going to come to me and say, hey, I've been working here for 2 years. I think I need a raise. I'm going to look at you like you're crazy, right? And so like, of course, I think any new provider is not going to say, I need a contract. But I think as a provider, if someone's not offering a contract, then you should be asking some detailed questions of like, when would my performance evaluation occur? How do raises work? How our payment structure? Like, I know recently an organization I worked for, it was like everyone was paid, across the board a salary. And now it's tied to how many patients you see, right? And then it was tied to like your patient outcomes, like the numbers of like
quality measures.
Your quality measures, like that. You want that detail, because If it's not, then they can automatically, and it could be arbitrary on like, oh, you didn't do this or you didn't do that. And so no, you no
Right.
longer have a job.
Right.
But you have nothing to bring to an attorney to say, hey, I lost my job. This was our contract. Like, what should I do? If you don't have a contract, no attorney's going to talk to you.
Yeah. Yeah. So quality measures being things like percentage of patients with diabetes, A1C less than 9%, and colon cancer screening maybe, and depends, I think, what the measures are that they're looking for, like what percentage of those metrics, generally speaking.
So if your pay is tied to those metrics, you want that to be brought out.
Documented.
Protect yourself in case of someone who tries to say that you're not doing what it is that you're doing. You can say, well, this was a contract that I had and this is what we agreed to. And it also, things change. Like people will get you into a job and tell you that you'll be doing one thing, and then you get there and all of a sudden you're doing another. And if you don't have anything to protect you or to say like, this is what we originally agreed to, you're stuck doing whatever it is that they tell you to do.
Yeah. And I think a couple of people had asked about hiring a contract lawyer, and they found it to be a little cost prohibitive. So like, I don't know. I don't, it depends. I think the rates are different. And what is your perspective? Like, do you think that should be requisite? Cause I feel like I had no idea what a contract lawyer was. I had no idea. I was clueless when I had a brand new job as an NP.
So I think one of the things I think is hard, and why I try to have more conversations about healthcare and the legal world and why that connects, is it's very secretive and a mystery. Unless you are an attorney and you know attorneys or you have attorneys in your family, you really don't know what goes on. You don't know what is a good rate or what is a not so good rate, if it's inflated. You don't know what you're going to get for $750 if that's what someone's asking, right? So some attorneys are charging $350 an hour up to $1,000 an hour, depending on like how big of a law firm that they work for. So no, and nurse practitioners should not necessarily go find an attorney at a law firm, because they're gonna bill you and it's gonna be something that you just can't afford, and it's very discouraging. And then there are a lot of solo practitioners or like attorneys who have their own practices who just don't advertise well enough. So you just don't know where to look or where to start if they're trustworthy. You know, we've had that conversation about working with attorneys who just don't understand, you know, what it is that you do. And so we as attorneys sometimes struggle with trying to find other resources of other attorneys. There are so many attorneys in this country, but yet when you're looking for something very specific, all of a sudden you can't find anyone. But I do feel like, yes, like a lot of people use things like LegalZoom and like these different apps and websites to create contracts or to use their services, and not to say they're not bad, but sometimes they don't have your best interest in mind, right? And so they don't understand healthcare. They're just a lawyer who's contracted to work with LegalZoom, and they're just gonna do whatever they feel is okay, and they don't really have any health or legal experience. So there are, like, if you're in a position where you need an attorney, you don't have resources, you can reach out to like law schools, surprisingly. A lot of law schools have clinics, and that is like right up their alley. Like if you call a law school and the students are in clinic, usually during the school year, and sometimes in the summer, and say, hey, is there anyone available to review my contract? So it would be maybe a student reviewing your contract, who's probably going to be more detailed than a regular attorney because they don't have anything else to do. But they'll be supervised by a licensed attorney. So it's not necessarily outside of, you know, like it's not just a student doing the work for you. It's actually two attorneys or a future attorney and an actual licensed attorney doing that work.
That sounds great.
So that's a good place to start if you're in a position, or if they can refer you. Like a lot of times, like I went to Howard Law, which is in DC. If it was something that we couldn't do, they would make it their business to connect you with a lawyer who could help and get you the resources that you need. So that's a good place to start, is to find a law school in your area, in your city, or in your state, to find some resources to help you. Even though people aren't in the office, they're still connected via email, even sometimes via phone, to make sure that people are getting what it is, you know, what they need. And there also are like legal aid offices. Like you may not feel like you qualify for legal aid, but you also don't want to pay somebody $1,000 an hour to look at a contract that may take them 5 hours to them, right? Like that's not acceptable. But legal aid is a great resource, right? So legal aid, yes, are for people who cannot afford a lawyer. But if you call them and say, hey, I'm looking for a lawyer who does X, Y, and Z, they have a list of lawyers who either does inexpensive work or who does pro bono work. But a lot of times those lawyers who sign up to do pro bono work is what they do voluntarily, but they also work as regular lawyers. So those are usually the ones who have lower rates. And you can have access to provide you whatever resources that you need. So I would say, yes, if you can read your own contract, you can take the risk to do it. But there are times like I've read a contract for nurse practitioners specifically, and I'm like, what happens when that, like, what would you do if that happened, right? Like they didn't mention anything about pay, or they didn't mention anything about that. Like, let's talk about the structure, or the requirements are so high. I'm like, you really gonna see 100 patients in a month? Like, is that, like, how's that gonna work? That volume, you know, what does that look like? What support do you have? You know, those kind of things. And so and then they're able to go back to the table and say, what support do I have? How am I supposed to get that done? How many hours am I supposed to commit to that? If I, you know, or, you know, people are now giving unlimited PTO. That may be a little bit rare in healthcare, but in certain situations, if you're giving unlimited PTO, how do I request that? Do I get paid? You know, like, there are just other questions that you have to ask that you wouldn't think about as a normal person, because you're so excited about the opportunity. And that excitement kind of sometimes puts a block in front of you. It doesn't allow you to necessarily ask the appropriate questions.
Totally. So a couple other things we wanted to cover. Scope of practice. Do you want to talk about scope of practice?
Yeah, I think nurse practitioners, you know, are just, to me, the best care providers. I love them.
So nice. I love them.
No, they are just so detailed and so good. And, you know, they just have a heart. Because some providers are just like, you don't have a heart. You don't care about me. And I think, of course, it's state-based. It depends what your state allows. Like, I am a Maryland bar attorney. So Maryland is a full practice state where nurse practitioners can work independently. So they have the autonomy to do a lot of different things, whereas certain states have not passed those rules. So you have to look at the scope that is laid out by the Board of Nursing or whoever governs you in your state as to what it is that you can do. If you're in a situation where providers asking you to do something that you feel like may be out of your scope, if you work in a setting where you have a risk manager or compliance officer or an attorney on the team, you should reach out to them, because they're the ones who write the policies, and they're gonna say, oh, no, that's not okay. I'll talk to them. I'll make sure you're protected.
Yeah.
If you're in a situation where you don't have that, you can always call the board and ask, or email the board and say, like, you know, is this within my scope? Can I do that? And they're not going to penalize you for asking questions. Even if you already did it, no one's going to say, like, you know, you didn't know. And that's why you're asking the question. And so making sure that you're comfortable with your scope, I think, is what it's really, some of the challenges I feel like nurse practitioners have. It's like, this is all you can do. Make sure you're comfortable in those things, right? So, like, if they're asking you to do, we didn't really talk about specifically, but FMLA paperwork, that is within your scope, right? How do you do that effectively and efficiently is not up to someone to explain to you. That's up to you as a provider to learn the best tips, the tools, how to, you know, how to protect yourself, how to make sure that everything that is true is documented, and what is not true that the patient may be asking you to write down is not documented, like those kind of things. So there is also some responsibility on the nurse practitioner to get educated, to find the resources that they need to. That's what CE credits are for. You know, when they're, you know, you're going to sign a contract, and hopefully they're giving you thousands of dollars to use those CE credits, use them for things that you know that you're struggling with. But those areas where you have lots of questions, use that money to dig deeper, because there are so many resources out there. And I say to be careful. Like, I think social media is an amazing tool. But in the recent weeks, I'm realizing that people are taking that as, like, the information that is shared on social media as gold. You know, and it's not, right?
I mean, my stuff is gold.
Of course, but it's not just social media. You're actually providing curriculum that is well-rounded and nuanced, and information that provides people an opportunity to ask more questions. Right? But there are some resources that are out there that is just spewing information that is not necessarily nuanced, and it's not allowing people to ask questions. So I feel like more people are asking about medical malpractice insurance because people are saying you need medical malpractice insurance. They're hearing that from somewhere. I never thought about having medical malpractice insurance as under like 12 years ago.
Yeah.
Why would I? I work for an organization, right?
Totally.
And so it's like someone is saying that somewhere. That information is being spewed somewhere, saying that you need to protect yourself. You need this. You need why, right? And so there's no opportunity to ask the question why, which then leads people to make decisions that may not be appropriate for them.
Yeah, no, totally. And I think like the question kind of with scope, I think there were a couple of example questions. We weren't trying to do like too specific stuff. But like, kind of like if you have a family nurse practitioner and you're working in a psych setting, like a psychiatric mental wellness health setting, like versus, you know, if you're, I don't know, there's so many like branches off of examples, but I think you're like, it really just sounds like it comes down to state and the board of nursing. And yeah, hopefully.
It comes down to the support. So if a providers ask you to do something independently and never checking back up and never giving you the training that you need, and you don't have anybody to partner with to make these types of very crucial decisions that you don't feel like you're trained on, scope or no scope, like don't do it, right? Like that's not appropriate. But if they're giving you extensive amount of training, like they are giving you access to someone who has extensive, you know, experience working with that patient population, then, and you're doing the care as a practitioner that's within your scope, I don't think that's wrong, right? Like, I think that you have the resources that you need to ask questions when you run into a situation that you're not comfortable with, that you received extensive amounts of training, that you should, you know, make you more comfortable with the patient population that you'll be taking care of. Like, that's okay, as long as that's within your state, within your scope. That may be a new environment. Right? Like, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's outside of your scope. So that's like a nurse practitioner who's done med surg, and now they're being put in a critical care unit. But all of a sudden, you know, you've gotten 3 months of training and you have a provider who can answer every single one of your questions, or who will, like, that's okay. Like, it's not easy. It may be tough. We've seen that happen in the hospitals, people being thrown all over the place. We get it. It's not ideal. But if you have the resources and the support, then it doesn't mean that it's outside of your scope.
Absolutely. Well, I think what is one more question we can tackle? What do you think? Grab bag.
Yeah. So I think there are a couple like things we wanted to highlight. I think we said we were talking about at the beginning, but we forgot. Someone asked something about like estate planning and protecting your assets. You were in a situation where someone attempted to sue you. Like, how do you do that? You have to talk to a estate planning lawyer. I do not do estate planning at all. There are some amazing resources out there. The Just In Case lawyer is someone who I follow who does estate planning. She's in Texas though, but
is she right?
Yeah,
she's great. I know. I think I was going to ask that if it was state based. I think you have to say some.
It's definitely state based, but she would at least be able to point you in the right resources, to the right resources.
Totally.
Because she's an estate planning lawyer and they have their own communities and things like that. So yes, there are some things I think that you should do, but that's very specific, and you have to meet with an estate planning lawyer to figure out what you have and what should be protected, and what's not, you know, what can be left out or what can be put in, right? So that's a very specific question, but I think meeting with an estate planning lawyer is crucial at that point. And usually estate planning lawyers aren't as expensive as people think. I think we assume all attorneys are really expensive, but estate planning lawyers, you know, the value of estate planning is so valuable, and that when you treat people well, they're going to continue to come back. So estate planning lawyers usually don't, you know, charge crazy amounts of money, because you have to come back and update your paperwork. Like every year, every few years, you may have more kids, or you may have bought a house. So like if someone's paying, you know, $30,000 for an estate plan, they're never going to come back to update. And that doesn't help the estate planning lawyer. So I feel like don't ever assume that someone's more expensive than they may be. Just because it may be something that you're not familiar with. And you can always shop around and say, you know, what are your rates? And then you can always compare them to other people as well.
Totally. It is such a valuable thing that it's like a grown-up thing that I've been putting off.
I mean, I'm a bad lawyer and I'm also bad. So I move so much. So I'm like, I don't want to do an estate here. I mean, move. And then I've been in New York for 3 years. I should have had an estate.
It's
So
so valuable. It's like it's so important. It's like hard to see sometimes that there's like the work and the effort and the money and like how much it pays off eventually. But you were there. Did you want to touch on kind of like the FMLA pre-op COVID work letter question?
yeah, I mean, I
On
think
that.
in more detail, when you're talking about, it's a little bit of documentation in FMLA paperwork, pre-op clearances. So I think with FMLA paperwork, you just have to be very specific and honest about the symptoms that the patient is having. Where I used to work, people would just be like so vague, and then the patient would have to come back and come back and come back until it was corrected. What the job or the employer is looking for is like, can they come back to work? Like, so if you're saying, patient is having difficulty walking, that does not mean anything to the employer because they may be at a job that they're seated. So, okay, you may have to take you a while to walk in here, but if you can get in here and get to a chair, you can work, right? So you need to be detailed and speak enough to, if that patient can sit in a chair for 8 hours, ask the patient what type of work environment that they work in and what it is that they do and what their job is asking them to do. Like if they're on light duty, some people can go back to work on light duty. That makes sense. But for some people, that's not even an option.
Yeah.
And so when it's not an option, you have to speak specifically to what that person can do. They cannot walk more than 500 feet without having severe pain, right? It should be that specific. They cannot sit in a chair for more than 2 hours without, having crippling pain. So they may need to be at home in a bed, lay down in their house because it just doesn't make sense, right? You need to be able to speak specifically to what it is that their job description is and what is their job is asking them to do. And then, whatever symptoms or issues that they may be having medically and how that's impossible for them to, be able to manage their health while at work.
Totally.
Because that's what the job doesn't want to be responsible at work for someone who, comes in and has a stroke or a heart attack because they can't manage their care. But they also want to know, like, they also don't want to put someone out who may not need to be put out of work, right? Because that is costly for them. So I think those specifics, would be more helpful on FMLA paperwork. Pre-op clearances, I see crazy things with those too, but the surgeon wants to know that they're not going to get in trouble for taking care of a patient who is not really medically ready. And so, it is important that we're doing the hemoglobin A1Cs and the blood sugars and whatever other pre-testing that needs to be done, the EKGs and all of those things, and ensuring that they're accurate and correct or done in a timely manner so that the surgeon's not put at risk. Because I think what people don't understand about a pre-op clearance, it really gives the surgeon an idea and the anesthesiologist an idea of what protections they need to put in place to protect themselves to make sure that the patient doesn't die on the table and now they're being sued. Right. So it's like, if we have to think of these documents as a team effort, it's not just you protecting yourself. It's not you just protecting the patient. You're also protecting the next provider when it comes to the pre-op clearance. So it does need to be detailed. All the sections should be filled out. You shouldn't just see, sometimes you can see, attachments or things like that when it's too wordy, but you want to make sure that you're referring them back to something, that you're not just things blank. And then, asking them to assume that hasn't been done.
Yeah. I think like the understanding that I've pulled, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think there's like kind of like two things. One is like making sure that it's documenting their kind of current clinical status appropriately, doing the testing that they've requested. And then, which is like actually kind of a side conversation. There's like I think Curbsiders has a podcast about like the evidence around how much testing we actually need to do versus like what makes us feel better, whatever. I just kind of go based on what they need from me. And then the other thing is you can say like no contraindications for surgery, but like not to say clearance. And correct me if I'm wrong. I don't know if you have any thoughts about the verbiage to say like, because if you say clearance, then that you're more on the hook or something. I don't know. It may be totally false.
Yeah, I don't think that's true. I wouldn't say no contraindications, because there may be a contraindication of like, why they may not need the surgery, but it may, the benefit analysis may be that it's more important that they get the surgery, even though it may be a risk that they may die. Right. So I wouldn't say no contraindications, because a lot of times patients do have contraindications of why they shouldn't go to surgery.
Right. But
And
it's
they're
more like a
making,
risks benefit discussion, it sounds like, just
yeah,
documenting
definitely.
that.
That is really up to the surgeon to have. So I definitely wouldn't write no contraindications. And I don't think clearance or anything, that those specifics make you more on the hook or not.
More
Because
liable.
all you're doing, like, I think the pre-op clearance really is what the provider is at, like what the surgeon is asking for, the surgeon may be asking for. It's not asking you to say, like, this patient is not going to die if they get to surgery. Like, that's not their expectation.
Right.
The expectation is that you just do whatever it is that we ask you to do to make sure that we're protected and we
Right.
have a good idea. And I think sometimes people underestimate the power of those documents, because the anesthesiologist really is the person who takes into consideration some of that information for themselves and how they're going to manage the patient. So you don't put that the patient has sleep apnea.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
And that they are not on their machine and they're not taking it seriously and they're not, that's a huge,
it's important. Really
and
important.
very important for an anesthesiologist or a nurse anesthetist to take into consideration when they're putting someone to sleep, right? Like, that's what it really is. It's like making sure you're putting enough information for the next provider to be able to protect themselves.
Totally. And then I think like the clinical, because I can hear the questions of like the clinical questions, like your decision, like that is a separate topic, I think, for NPs to dig into, is like having the conversations about the risk benefits and deciding if it's appropriate. Like that's a separate conversation. We're mostly talking about like, once you've had that conversation, what you're documenting and all that stuff.
But I don't think it's really up to even the primary provider to decide if it's appropriate. It's up to the surgeon, because
it's
some
both.
surgeons are risky and then like, you've had 5 open heart surgeries and you have all these stents and you have a high risk of getting a blood clot.
Right.
But if we don't fix your aneurysm, you're going to die tomorrow, right? And you as a provider may say, ooh, this patient may not be ready to be cleared, but the surgeon may say, it may have reasons as to why they want to move forward.
Right.
So yes, like definitely both, but it's like, I don't think that you guys should take on so much pressure.
You're right.
Because the risk that comes out of it, I feel like there's very rarely been instances where the pre-op clearance is why someone gets sued.
Yeah.
They never really go back to that. Like, even the surgeries that I've had, the surgeries that I've seen have been really big payouts or really big cases. It never really boils down to the pre-op or to the primary provider. It is what the surgical team did or didn't do, and never what they took into consideration. It usually has to do with the outcome. So was the surgeon actually capable of, well trained, or had the resources or whatever to do the surgery that they did, and was the outcome a part of the risk that were explained to the patient?
Right. That's
right. And so I think that is usually what happens when I've seen the ugliest cases. It's usually like the surgeon did something egregious, pre-op cleared or not. It was not the primary care provider's, problem. And I think it's hard to go that far back for an attorney. I think people think that people are looking for people to sue. No. I know so many attorneys who will turn down a case in a second. Like, they're like, I'm not doing that. Like, it's too, because it's costly to try to go after and find out the right information to review it's expensive for the attorney, because you don't get paid unless they get paid. So unless it's a straight shot, it's very rare that an attorney's going to invest the time and the money to go after a primary provider in a situation with a surgeon who has more coverage, who has more malpractice insurance, who's covered by a hospital.
Right.
We're not going after the primary care provider, right? So I think when you think about it like that, not to say you should completely relax about it, but I think you should take into consideration that people aren't going to backtrack that far and try to put some type of blame on you, because then it's going to be like, okay, I said that they were cleared. That had this outcome.
It doesn't really work like that. Yeah,
it doesn't. It rarely ever works. It goes that far back.
Totally. Well, should we wrap up?
Yeah. I think someone was asking a little bit about fraud.
Yes.
If people want to talk about fraud, I do some things on Instagram talking about fraud.
Yes.
But the Office of the Inspector General puts out a report every day, pretty much. But you can go to the Office of the Inspector General, which is the feds, basically, and look at the cases that they're going, the people who they're either indicting or sending to jail or
I'm like so nosy. That's like a murder
so
crime series.
they're so good and so funny. People are
I've seen some of your posts. We were like,
girl, how did you think you were going to get a kickback? Oh, come on. A hot mess. So they're juicy and fun. Like, so you, but literally it's the same thing happening over and over. Like, people are doing crazy things, and like someone is now looking for the money and trying to account for that, and now all of a sudden their whole plan is exposed. So if you have questions about fraud, that's a good place to start, because the feds are way more aggressive than the states when it comes to fraud. But the feds are aggressive. So
yeah, they do not play.
They don't play. If they review 100 charts and 2 charts show that they overbilled, they're gonna take that whatever that percentage is and times it times all of your patients.
Oh my.
The past year, and you're gonna pay them that money back.
Oh my.
Oh,
so this applies to me too.
Oh, definitely applies. Definitely applies. About billing is like, we can have a whole conversation about billing.
Yes.
All that usually in the hospitals, that's what really happens. And then in this conversation, we talked a little bit about decreasing liability and mitigating risk. But I'm working on something to really educate people on how to do that, because I think that is it's what we're kind of talking about today. Yeah. And people want to know, like, how can I prevent this from happening? And I think that most people are doing the right things. I think most providers are doing the right things. I think in 6 years, maybe 6,000 nurses and nurse practitioners have lost their license. And there are thousands and thousands, so it's like, and usually the reasons why people lose their license, it's because they did something really egregious, like kill somebody, or, drunk driving. Like, it's never usually like, I forgot to document. It is never that small. It is usually like a pattern of bad behavior, or people thinking that they're getting away with something and they're not. So I do hope that this conversation gives people an ability to relax a little bit and be the provider that you dreamed of. I think that if you get back to that, like, when I became a nurse, I wanted to be this person, be that person. And then all of the other issues and the things that you have and the skills that you're learning as a new nurse practitioner, or even as an experienced nurse practitioner, because things change every single day and you're always learning something new, will come with time, and you'll become better at it and more proficient at it. And if you take the pressure off of yourself, I think you can really become a better provider, because you can see people for who they are and not just the disease that they have.
Totally. Thank you so much for being here. This is just so wonderful. Do you want to tell people where they can find you? And
on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Pinterest. Don't go Pinterest because I'm a little messed up, but I'm Your Nurse Lawyer on everywhere.
Awesome.
You can reach out to me on Instagram if you have any other questions following up with this. If you listen to the podcast, I can, of course, always send people resources and things like other referrals. I help people find other attorneys that typically. So you can reach out to me, and I definitely will get back to you. And then on my Instagram page, all my contact information is there. But yes, I'm Your Nurse Lawyer. And I hope to really build a better healthcare system for healthcare providers, where they have a little bit more information and they know about these legal aspects, so that they can be more comfortable with doing what it is that they do best.
Totally. I'm so excited for everything you have coming up and all of that education coming. I can't wait. So thank you so much again. I so appreciate it.